be back. I feel like I should like have a chalkboard or a pointer. Does everybody remember secondary school, high school? Iffy. Do you want to remember? Not so much. I kind of feel like, a lot of times, we talk about these, we talk about secondary school a lot, but sometimes I find if you put yourself back into the mindset, like remember what it was like when you went through secondary and what you were going for, like what was the purpose, what was the goal, what was like, were you just trying to finish up the exams? Were you just trying to, there's so much culture wrapped up in the secondary experience, both our national cultures, our, environment. And I think sometimes we forget about it when we're looking at the documents, what the students are going through or experiencing at the same time that they're earning those documents, right? And it really, the experience of secondary school and the culture of where you're doing it is so different from place to place. And you find that reflected in the education system. So in the United States, we have a very comprehensive secondary school experience. Students are going through secondary school sometimes with an eye to higher ed, sometimes with a job, but they're getting a very comprehensive, across the board, every subject all the time type of experience. Some states have high stakes graduation exam requirements, others don't. But there's also a culture in the United States of that secondary whole life experience with non-curricular activities, so sports and clubs and the experience of it. The local high school in the town where I live recently hosted exchange students from Spain for 2 weeks. And so I have a daughter who's in her final year. She's friends with some of the hosts. And she was telling me that the Spanish students were very disappointed that there weren't more dance breaks in the school. That there weren't more, flash mob style High School Musical experiences. There's so much of, and likewise, our US students from our high school are going to go to Spain in, I think, February. And they're a little nervous about what they're going to experience. And they're not talking about just the academic experience, right? Dave alluded to earlier that many of us come into this profession having had some sort of cross-cultural experience, whether it was study abroad or hosting someone, experiencing a move, some sort of migration experience. For me, it was study abroad at the secondary level. I just wanted to see what life was like somewhere else. And so I spent a year in Denmark at a Danish school, not a public school, but a private school, actually, in Denmark. And clearly it's influenced me, because here I am. But I had to fight for my school in the United States to recognize the experience as a valid secondary school experience, and the classes. And I spent a lot of time explaining to my peers, my 17 and 18-year-old peers, what was different, what was the same, how was it different, how was it the same. And here I am 30 years later, still telling people what was the same and what was different. And I find that really interesting that when we're talking about secondary, in a lot of the workshops I've ever been to, that gets removed. Those cultural nuances of secondary school gets removed. So I want to make sure that we're constantly having those in mind and in our heads and in our thinking. So just remember that while you're looking at these documents, that these teenagers who are receiving them are teenagers. Their brains are not fully formed. We sometimes expect them to know exactly what is next and why they're doing it, and to retain that. You know, if they've moved, if they've had a migration experience, for some reason, we still expect them to remember what they did 10, 15, however many years ago with their secondary documents, and locate their schools to get the credentials, to locate the experience again in their heads. So I just personally think that that's something very important that we all remember. Gets to the person behind the document, behind the credential, right? If you want to share any secondary high school experiences, let me know. We can talk. But in the meantime, let's move on and talk about the actual documents themselves. Okay, so when we're looking at secondary school documents, we need to think about what information is reflected on the document that we are examining and looking at. Whether it's a tactile in front of us or on a screen, a digital, what information is that document conveying about the person who has achieved it, right? Generally speaking, there is an institution name or an examination board name, right? The document should tell us who issued it, where it's coming from. It's written here curriculum, but really what it should be is course list, right? What are the courses? What were the topics of study that the student had during their secondary experience? You know, often for admission officers, we might be checking, did they have maths? Did they take an English or another language? Did they take history, physical education? Are we considering subjects like music? There's an assessment of their performance within the system that they completed. How did they do? How well did they retain the information? How much can they show us or demonstrate their understanding of those courses, of the curriculum? Hopefully there's dates of attendance so that we can, as evaluators, match their age and their dates. Is it an appropriate match? You know, or is this a student that we need to look a little deeper at? Maybe there's a really wide dichotomy between, you know, they seem a little young to have finished secondary education. You know, they're only 12, like you said, one of the universities, right? Or maybe they're a little older. This is a 30-year-old, and they're presenting me with a secondary school document. What's the story here? It could be a legitimate story, or it could not be. And then again, the recognition or authority of who is submitting that. Sometimes it's the same as the institution or the board, and sometimes it's very different. Sometimes, and so you see on the other side of the slide, the question marks, right? The scale of assessment is not always on a secondary document, and that's where sometimes it gets confusing. You see that more frequently on university documents and university transcripts, but sometimes the secondary, it's just assumed, and it's not there, and we have to do some research. An average of assessment. So for those of us who are looking for university admission, we might want to find out, okay, I don't care about the individual, I just want the average, how they performed. Failure. Whether or not a student has failed in demonstrating their knowledge sometimes is on a secondary document and sometimes it's not. And that failure can go back to that cultural comments that I was making earlier. Because is failure bad? Is failure necessary to know about? Or does it matter? If they failed the examination, it's not going to appear. So West African Examination Council candidates, for example, if they've failed an exam, it doesn't appear on their report, their examination report.
Until you verify it, and then it appears.
Right.
Which is great.
Which is interesting, right?
We can see that just by logging in and using their, scratch card number or whatever, and seeing that. But the larger question is, do failures matter so much? From a U.S. perspective, I think there's been a tendency to not want to fail students as much because the burden of failure, follows a student. Even if the student has cleared the course later, some universities expunge the failure once you pass the course, some don't. In secondary school, it's the same, but failing an exam and retaking it is not such a big deal in some other countries as it has traditionally been viewed in the U.S. And things are changing here, but I think that's one of the reasons for the grade inflation that sometimes occurs, is that a failure was seen as a catastrophic failure of the individual as a human being. But it's good to know if somebody failed courses and couldn't clear them versus if somebody failed courses and was able to clear them with, and then you have an idea of how their grading is.
Does anyone have a good example of where it's very common?
I can provide you with an example that we faced with, I don't know how many years ago, 7, 8 years ago. We had a pupil from Belgium, and she was applying for a particular university in Croatia. It doesn't matter which one. And we were provided with her secondary education certificates for the past 4 years. And we noticed that in the second year she had 2 negative grades. Now, in our country, you cannot proceed to the next year unless you have all positive grades. We have a grading system from 1 to 5. 1 is negative, which means that you failed. From 2 is the lowest positive, and 5 is the best one. And she had 2 negative grades. And we told her, we are sorry, but we cannot admit you into the university because you failed. And then she told us, but in our country it doesn't matter, because in Belgium you can have up to 2 negative grades in a year and still proceed legally to the next year. Then we had to contact the school to check if it was real, because the student can say anything. And then they confirmed that. They said, yes, in Belgium you can actually have up to 2 negative grades in a year and still proceed into the next one. So we had to update our system, because normally, as I told you, we have this grading system from 1 to 5. But for example, in the US you have from A to F. In France they have from 1 to 20. In Germany they have from 1 to 6, with 6 being the worst and 1 being the best. So when we enter in this admission system, this online system where they apply, we also have the so-called conversion tables. So what we do when we receive foreign grades, we enter the grades as they are, but then they get translated automatically. We do not do it by hand, but it's done automatically. It's translated into Croatian system. But what happened, for example, with those Belgian grades, when we translated those, their failure translated into our grade 1, and then the system blocked it. So we had to ask for our IT experts who built the system to revise it and to update it so Belgian students and students also from some other countries, where they can have failing grades that they can actually pass.
Sure, it happens in France too, or in French patterns, right? You can have so many failing individual subject marks on the baccalaureate exam, as long as the overall summary is within that passing level.
Mm-hmm. It's an excellent example, yeah. I'm thinking of India as maybe a classic example of where, failed and retaken exams are not seen as so terrible and, like a black mark on your character and ability. I see this more at the university level, but also somewhat at the secondary level with, the backlogs, right? They're allowed to sort of fail and retake as many times as they need to, and as long as they pass in the end, they could end up with first class. It's not...
Sorry, we also had another example from Australia. Unfortunately, I can't remember which part of Australia it was. I sent an email to my colleague, so maybe he will text me back and tell me. We had a student who never finished her last year of secondary education, And it turned out, to make the long story short, it turned out that she can actually get admitted to the university because she took some professional tests.
So, yeah, we'll bring that up in a little bit. Those type of
the last year in my country, that would be the 4th year. She never even attended it, but she did prove us that she had certain Australian officially recognized certificates of professional qualification, I think it was called economics, and that was found sufficient by the Australian university to recognize that her secondary education was actually finished, although it was not.
That's a perfect gray area example, and we have a few of those those that sort of don't follow the traditional pattern, but they have a certain benchmark that allows them entry to further education, but not through traditional routes.
Yeah.
So
We'll
that's
talk
a good
about that
good
later
one.
this afternoon.
Yeah.
And so that's, some of these things are the other information. If we get back to what's on the actual document, right? Sometimes there's other information beyond assessment scales, averages, failures, all these other details. I'm wondering if anyone has anything else that they know of from their home system that might appear on a secondary document.
Or might not appear.
Or might not appear, if any of these don't appear.
Can I,
Yeah, of course.
when you're talking about this coursework, which courses they have, sometimes we always ask for the translation either into our language or into English. Even when we speak the language, due to the official reasons, we have to ask for it. But sometimes the translation itself does not correspond with the
To
real
what it actually was.
For example,
Sure.
the American student has a subject which is called science. It's actually recognized by us as biology, physics, and chemistry. So, for example, if they want to attend medical school in Zagreb, that's capital of Croatia, the University of Medicine is actually asking as their requirement the students have at least 2 years of biology, chemistry, and physics. Now, a pupil from the United States arrives and he doesn't have that on his or her secondary education certificate. So then I need to know, or my colleague needs to know, that science actually encompasses those 3. Or, for example, in France, they have Sciences de la Terre, which would be, that would be literally translated science of Earth.
Yeah.
Now, when I started doing the job, that was back in 2010, I thought that was geography, like science of the Earth.
Sure.
And the student was actually also applying for medical university, and fortunately we all managed to do it on time, and we entered geography, and she didn't meet the requirements. And then she contacted us and told us, but this is actually, this Sciences de la Terre is actually biology, which we did not know. So sometimes you cannot simply translate from one language to another, but you also have to know what's contained in the subject.
Exactly.
And even if you have a translation or not a translation issue, sometimes there just is very little information about the content of the course in general. Like if it's mathematics 1, mathematics 2, you don't know if that's pre-algebra or if that's calculus. It could be any spectrum of mathematics. So, I think that there sometimes is some missing information on the transcript. And maybe it matters, and maybe it doesn't. If you just need to know that they've met that qualification and can enter university in their country, therefore yours, and that they have decent grades, then maybe that's all you need to know. But if you need to know whether they took specific courses, or if they took at least, a full sequence of science with lab, or if they took, an X number of years of language, for instance, or something, then you need to dig a little bit deeper and maybe ask for more information.
So that more information, exactly. So in terms of also the number of hours or units or how much contact, right? Because there are some, so when I came back from Denmark in my secondary year, my high school said, you took 15 different classes, and I said, well, yeah, but not, obviously, I wasn't in school for 15 hours a day, whereas in my US school, every subject that appeared on my high school transcript, I would be in every single day for a 45-minute to hour-long period. So there were only 7 subjects per year, right? So I came home and now there are 15 subjects and they're thinking 15 hours is a long day, right? And so that other information that's not appearing is how much time, how much contact time is being had within each subject, within each topic or unit. And so that's something that, again, might not be important if you're just looking at the benchmark to determine whether they have completed, but if you're looking at, do they qualify for this particular program or next experience that they're looking at, that might be important for them. We want to look at a couple of documents. I will go ahead and acknowledge they're maybe a little bit difficult to see, but we want to describe a little bit about what we're talking about with all of these different topics that are on here. Dave, this is the Korean one. Do you want to talk about how much information is on the Korean secondary here? I'll make it bigger for you so that you can see. So Korea is an interesting example because there's 4 different grades.
Yeah, I mean,
on the transcript.
I have spent a lot of time sort of dissecting Korean secondary transcripts just to sort of figure out, how do I make this easier to look at? How do I distill all of this information that's on the actual transcript into something that I can easily identify as, here are their grades, like which lane do I choose? Because they have the percentage grade, the like standard deviation, right? like the average based on their peers in that same class, and then they have the rank score, of on a scale of 1 to 9. So, which do you choose? Do you choose the percentage grade? Do you take into consideration the average, deviation? Do you pick the rank? Anybody work with Korean secondary? You want to talk about what you do? Yeah, go ahead, Rachel.
We go based on the rank. One of my supervisors has experience in working in Korea, and that's what her executive decision was, as a comparison based on her peers. And we also have the community college component at Georgia State with 2-year degrees, so we do have partnerships with certain institutions in Korea where students maybe can do as well if they were lower ranked, they can take those places tests.
Yeah.
And do that 2-year program.
And if you think about it logically, right, the rank should be consistent with or like proportional to the percentage, right? So they're going to match. So really it is, I think, easier, I would agree with you, to just look at the rank. I think Korea is also another interesting example of I've never seen, I don't know if any of you have ever or will ever see a failing grade on a Korean high school transcript.
So that I have.
You have?
But
don't
they've
think they
failed technically, but since the rest of the class failed too, they proportionately did not fail.
So they're not, yeah. So
it's right.
You'll never
but
see an actual
so the point of the Korean transcript is to show you how much information you can actually have on the document, right? The institution, the scale is actually, I think it's cut off on the bottom of this one, but there is a scale. You can take a lot of information from the rank, from the percentage, from a lot of this. And I'm just going to say, apologize for the lack of redactedness, and we will...
Full disclosure.
We will correct that
my
going
error.
forward. But you can also know, where the institution is from, who has signed it. There's a lot of information on this document.
And it's also important to note with this one that there is a separate school transcript that lists, all of the years of study sort of comprehensively on one document, and then a separate graduation diploma, or, that it's the graduation isn't listed on the transcript itself necessarily, that you'll have 2 documents, the high school transcript and the graduation diploma together. So this is the
graduation certificate indicating that they've finished, whereas this is the transcript of study. So the other part about documents is final and provisional results, right? Did you want to talk about that?
Sure, yeah. So this example that's up here from the Punjab School Education Board, this is a fairly recent document. This was sent in to us as a question noting that the student had provided a provisional certificate, and is this enough information on which to proceed? And we looked at the document, and we saw that they actually had the final certificate along with the memorandum of marks. So that was easily resolved. But the point being that you may have a provisional document that's admitted before the actual certificate is issued, and that's a documentation issue in terms of when you're going to accept the provisional, when you're not. If the official certificate hasn't been issued yet, the provisional document usually has a legal recognition. In India, it happens to be for as long as you don't have the official certificate. Sometimes, like in Spain, they'll cut their provisional certificates off in a calendar year. This is valid a year from this date, and then boom, you have to get another one if you don't have, sometimes they haven't paid the tramite, all the fees for getting it. But in any case, the official certificate, you'll see if a student from India specifically is applying for admission to your institution before the April, May, or June exams, they won't have those final, what we're calling the final grades from the external examination board. Maybe a state board, it may be an all India central board, but the point is that you would be looking at the school marks. In this case, we have provisional marks from the examination board, so it's one step up from the internal school marks. So you might look at that if you didn't have their certificate, but we would always hold out once the certificate is issued for the final certificate. This one happens to have the marks included. A lot of times in India you have a separate certificate and then a statement of marks that goes along with that. So the subjects might be listed on the certificate but without grades, but you'd have a separate grading marks
But
certificate.
I'm curious if anyone else has any other provisional final documentation regulations. Yeah, UK.
Yeah. And those might be, issued to the student sort of for their knowledge, until while they're waiting for their official, results to arrive.
They also use the provisional results to get the idea which universities they might qualify for.
Predicted grades or that kind of thing. Mm-hmm.
Does anyone use them, or do you not even consider?
We do use it, like predicted grades from the IB system.
Use predicted from the IB?
We actually look at all their career, but also
Would you ever declare that someone has the comparable secondary education if they have only a provisional certificate? Or would you wait until the final is issued before you say, yes, they have the comparable secondary?
It really depends on the country for us, because in some, we have a lot of applicants from the neighborhood of Congo, and they haven't issued the diploma in years. So we kind of have to go up the provisional certificate. But as long as I can go on the exam board's website, find their name on that list of 8 million people who graduated that year, then we prove that they passed because that 49%. But it depends. And in some countries, they only get one copy and that's it, and they lose it.
Right, and it matters if they've legitimately finished and just don't have it yet because of time and bureaucracy and whatever, or if they, don't have it, never got it because they didn't actually go through those final, steps.
Here's a question for you. How many of you know exactly where your high school transcript or certificate is right now, your secondary certificate? Why do you know exactly where it is?
because I might read a lot.
Because you might read a lot, okay. What, almost the whole Italy table here. Why do you know where your secondary documents are? Because you remember where you put it? I didn't know, okay. Do you just moved, so you know where it is?
No. I just know that it's in my mother's house, but I don't remember it exactly.
Okay,
I
alright.
know it's in the house somewhere.
Anybody else? Do you know where?
We used to keep all the documents relating to education in one single place.
Sure.
Should be there at least.
Should be. You're not sure.
That just shows how important it is in
how
some
unimportant.
places, to have it. Like, I happen to know where my grade reports dating back to probably the first or second grade are only because I had to clean out two different dwellings after the death of my parents. They remained married, but they had two places for reasons we don't need to go into. But there would have been no way that I thought that those documents had been retained.
Well, that's a better question. How many of your parents know exactly where your secondary school documents are, right? Maybe you don't know, but maybe your parent does.
I think it does depend on whether, like, maybe how big they are, right? Whether or not they're replaceable, or how old, how old they might be, or what you might need them for.
And that's an excellent point. How replaceable are secondary school documents? And say again? Do you still need them? Mm-hmm. Can they be issued, for eternity, though? Right? Is there some sort of database in that system that maintains secondary school completion records for the duration, or is the individual student responsible for holding onto and maintaining, right, that document? So I have no idea where my high school diploma is. The actual physical diploma came in a plastic cloth case, a little certificate, it had my name, it was about this big. I have no idea where it is, but I know where my high school transcript is, and I also know that my high school transcript contained the date of my completion of secondary. So in my case, I don't care where the certificate is. Could have been recycled for all I know. I'll never get another one. The school doesn't exist anymore. The records have been transferred a couple of times into a couple of places because it was a non-public institution, but I know how I can get the transcript. If the copy that I have is not official, I know where I can get another one, right? But that might not be the same case, and not everyone is going to carry their documents around with them. So it's something to consider, looking back again and saying, where is my high school document? I also found in the US, we issue typically quarterly report cards and then a yearly report card, a final year, for parents to see. So parents hold on to them. And I found again, my dad's things, my sophomore year, my second year in high school, so 10th grade report card. And that would have been the year before I left to do my study abroad year. I have a son who was a sophomore last year, completed 10th grade, and was doing terribly in his performance. Really, you just don't want your kid to perform like this, and he really was. And I was getting very frustrated. And then I found my sophomore 10th grade report, and I had to stop giving him a hard time because apparently I was not the best student either. I was
Doesn't matter how you start, it matters how you finish.
Well, and that's exactly, I have to keep remembering that, right? I was not a great student my sophomore year, but I did successfully complete a year in a completely different system, and then it went on, and I have a doctorate now, so something went right somewhere. The point of saying that is that the education systems that students are working in might not be a good match for the way they are learning and the way they are experiencing their knowledge, gaining, their knowledge getting. And that's something that we see within their results. Maybe that's why they're trying to get their higher education in another country. Maybe that's why they've migrated to another place. All just some things to think about when we think about documents and what they reflect. And in those same lines, non-academic secondary documents. And what do those documents reflect? Does it reflect the same type of learning, the same type of experiences? What type of information is being conveyed by the documents is always something that we need to consider, as much at secondary level as we do at tertiary levels. So just another example of an external exam document that is, again, not conveying individual years of information sharing, but what the student is performing at the very end.
And maybe not all of the subjects they studied, only the ones they chose to get examined in, right?
That microphone's very strong, sorry.
We have, there used to be something like 30 boards in the UK that were running the external exams, and now it's consolidating down. So at least we have that going for us. We won't see so many providers.
I think this was an example that I had of, the document that the students submitted was the one on the left, the internal school results. This is for Eritrea. And you can see here all of the coursework taken each of the years, all of the subjects studied, all of the grades received. But this is not actually the document that I would ask for to show degree equivalence or high school degree equivalence. It's the one on the right, which is the secondary school leaving examination. That's that benchmark credential. And really the only thing that I would use as an evaluator to assess whether the student had successfully completed secondary school. However, if you are at an institution and you need to know more detail about what subjects they studied year for year, you may want to ask for the internal high school transcripts as well. I'm not sure if this is a good example of this, but I've seen this quite often, especially with WAEC exams, where a student has performed pretty poorly on the WAEC and failed a certain number of examinations, some core academic subject examinations like math or English or science, but their internal transcripts show pretty good grades, and they would really like to be assessed based on those internal transcripts and the good grades, and not on the final WAEC examination. But it's not the internal high school grades that are used for determination of whether they're eligible for further education in their country. It's that WAEC exam. So, too bad. But the grades really don't always match.
Right, the grades don't always match what the student's performance could be if they were learning in another system. So, it kind of goes back to what is that secondary system conveying? Is the student expected to receive a bunch of information into their brain bank and then regurgitate it back like a teller machine? Is the student expected to receive information about general topics and then apply that information into other subjects or into other areas? The philosophies of education in education systems really come out in secondary education, probably more so than at university level. So if you're looking at a student who is very accustomed to lecture, retention, regurgitation, right? Those exams that they are studying for are very, very regimented. And their performance on that examination in that system may not reflect how they would perform at your higher education system in your country or in your institution. But they're still, again, a benchmark secondary credential, so maybe that's all you need. If it really gets into what the purpose of assessing, evaluating, recognizing the secondary level experience. And it becomes a lot more nuanced than the university level, because that education philosophy, I think, should be I want to say should, but I don't know if that's really right, should be taken into consideration, could be taken into consideration when you're looking at the secondary documents. The culture of the education system, the culture of the country, the topics, what's available, how accessible is secondary education to students in that country? Are there schools on every corner, or do they need to go an hour, either by foot or by bus or by some other means, to get to the local school? How much effort is being put into that educational experience by that student? Do they have barriers to their learning and their experiences in terms of, learning differences, physical differences that, they can't, the nearest school is an hour walk and they can't physically walk that far? Do they have family obligations or needs that are going to be priorities over their studies? Do they have financial implications? So, in my experience when I'm working with students, they have completed secondary many, many years past, or they are they have incomplete secondary for whatever reason. And so those are all considerations that I'm always taking under my, under my head and under advisement when I'm thinking about how to recognize their experience as a secondary school student. It's never for me just as black and white as, do they qualify? Yes, no, and why? Because I do think that that those cultural implications come out more.
The West African Exam Council is a perfect example of the, what the student's facing. It's a very small part of the age cohort that sits for the exams. I think the pass rate is under 30% overall. So the people that are sitting and passing, even with lower scores than they have reflected in their schools, the individual year performance, over the years, people have learned that you can't get a candidate whose grades aren't that good, who are very successful at university, and we just happen to know that grading is very severe, in the Ghanaian, Nigerian, exams and the WAC, whereas grading has not been so severe as to fail 3/4 of the population in maybe the British system or the UK exams. So.
Mm-hmm. And again, look back at your own secondary high school experience. Do you remember how you did? And where did it lead you? Where are you now based on where you did?
One of the things that we run into is we're seeing a lot more mixed curriculum schools, especially in West Africa. So we'll have a student, they might sit for IUCSE in year 11 and then apply for NECA in year 12. And now we have two sets of scores, very different GPAs. It's like, well, technically 5 IGCSEs is a high school diploma, so should we count this instead of white? What if you passed 5 white exams, but you failed math, you passed the math IGCSE exam? So can you mix and match? Which credential are we accepting as the trump card?
That's a good question, and I would argue that's a philosophical question. That what's the purpose? Maybe they were able to study better for the IGCSEs. It was the information was conveyed differently. You never know.
I'm all for empowering admissions officers to take control, because often the delineation of authority isn't clear at a university.
In the U.S.
In the U.S., right. And so if you claim the power, you often end up having it forever, just by hook or crook. So my 2 cents on that subject.
But that's a good question. And how is that treated at some of the non-U.S. institutions? If a student has 2 different secondary system documents, so if they have IGCSEs and they have higher secondary certificate examinations from India, which do you use? Or WIAC? Which one do you use? Is it like whatever came first? Anybody want to volunteer?
Sure. I mainly evaluate diplomas of students who want to attend bachelor degrees, and sometimes they have their national diploma or an IB diploma or an A-level diploma, and let's say for economics and management degree, they're required to have a certain score in mathematics, and they have SATs. And with SAT, they might have scored like a very high score. And in their actual diploma, their mathematics scores. It's not that. And we look into the SAT. Yeah.
Mutating that, whatever's going to be most advantageous for the student. And you have that flexibility.
In their diploma.
Rachel, your question reminded me of an interesting situation which kind of ties this subject back to sort of benchmarking and year counting also, just to tie them together. I had a situation where a student took the IGCSE but had only completed grade 10 and in India. So they had done the 10 of the 10 plus 2, the secondary leaving certificate, and then just sort of like didn't do the plus 2, just took the IGCSE kind of, to be able to get into university wherever he wanted ideally, but he's 15, 16, hasn't completed the full cycle in his home country. But what do you do in that situation, right? Where it's like not, the IGCSE is the British system, he hasn't completed secondary education in his home country, but he has taken this external exam that clearly there's no requirement that you follow through the British system, to take it. You can sort of pop in and take it and have that
So this is
qualification.
a good, this is a good segue point.
You would take the IGCSE as long as they passed it.
Math and English, they meet the GPA
Yeah.
requirement. I mean, because I made that argument and I was overruled.
Yeah. I mean, there's no really, I don't know if there's a right or wrong, right? It's, they have this qualification, this benchmark, but, it's sort of like they
It's
got
a
to
gray area.
skip over, like the last 2 years.
It's a gray area, and I think, we'll have more time this afternoon to really like get into groups and talk about some of these scenarios. But I want to spend some time, I want to turn it over to Karin to spend some time talking just about this. What are some alternative methods of assessing a secondary school document, credential, student, right? How do we talk about some alternatives?
So, this could be an entire workshop in itself, and is. And there's also going to be a few really important sessions throughout this conference on assessing refugee credentials. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it now. I'm mentioning it as one population of student who may have incomplete or insufficient or completely unavailable documentation, and what do you do in that case? How do you make a decision if you don't have the sort of traditional documents that you would need to make that decision? So that you can forward that in your own. Is it the wind?
I think it's the wind.
I'm glad we're inside and not
the
outside.
heating system.
Right, maybe, right.
That room apparently is even colder than this one. I've just heard. Not just. At the break, I heard that room was even colder than this one.
So, these are just some statistics, which I'm sure we're all well aware of. It just goes to show that the world is constantly changing. There's mobility, whether it's voluntary or not, all the time. Whether it's due to forced migration, to war, to natural disaster, whatever the case may be, there are people that need to leave their home country and interrupt their education, and may or may not have any documentation with them when they leave, and may not be able to get it once they have left. So, these are all things I know that we're all aware of, but the challenge to getting documentation for some of these individuals is because their education was interrupted, that they had to leave before they finished. Maybe they were enrolled at a refugee school, maybe they weren't, maybe they just left. And therefore they don't have that benchmark credential, they don't have that documentation that shows that they've completed. If they've attended a refugee school or a school that is sort of, if they have a qualification that's, how shall we say, like an interim or an unrecognized qualification that sort of falls between systems of education, if they're from Sudan, but they were educated at a refugee school in Uganda, but it's not the Sudanese system, it's not the Ugandan system, it's just a school that's in between, right? Like what type of status or recognition does that school or that qualification have? They may have something with them, but it's completely unofficial. It may not be very good quality. It might be a photocopy. It might be, something that just is a piece of paper. It might not be sufficient. You might not have sort of that neat and tidy combination of transcript and degree. Or they may not have any proof at all of their educational credentials. It's not in their possession. It's not attainable. The school has shut down. They're in asylum status, and it's not safe for the, it's for any number of reasons. There could be insufficient or lack of documentation. So, again, there's going to be sessions on this topic. We could talk about this for a long, long time, but, there are other ways that you can create a narrative, that you can try to fill in some of these gaps. And I'm curious if I'm confident that Chumea and other organizations have policies in place for this, whether it's through conducting an interview, whether it's through some other type of getting some sort of documentation or proof some other way. Anyone want to share kind of what their alternative assessment and methodology is if you have someone with incomplete? In the US, we have the GED, which is the General Education Diploma. It's an exam that you can take that sort of says this is equivalent to a high school diploma. Worst case, someone can take that and get the high school diploma equivalent if they have the language skills and et cetera, to do that. But
the GED is not an all-encompassing, it is a non-governmental, non-state recognized, it's done by the College Board. It's the same exact organization that does SAT. So some states use the GED for their high school equivalency examination. Other states do not. They use something called a HiSET, which is literally high school equivalency test. So there are two different or multiple different organizations which issue an examination to recognize a high school equivalency for that student.
there are placement tests that can be taken to determine a student's level in math or language or whatever it might be. So there are other ways that that we can do this. But what are some other creative solutions if someone is presenting no documents or insufficient, incomplete documents?
Well, our university has like an admissions track that they can essentially prove that they can do it. So it's like classes that they can take that are similar to what they would take if they were in the institution. And they can get letter grades. They can actually get credit for those courses as well, so they can convert it towards their credit towards their degree when they get admitted. So it's kind of like a provisional admission, but not really admission.
So once
sort
they're
of like a shadow track, kind of,
But once they graduate from your institution and they have the university level credential, it sort of by default indicates that they have the secondary. Is that what that would do?
Yeah, essentially. I mean, I think once in a lot of places, and it depends on the country, but a lot of places, once you have like a higher level credential, you almost don't need some of the lower level credentials. So like the secondary may not be as necessary once you have a bachelor's.
Well, I was just wondering if it's reflected on their transcript.
Oh no, it is not.
it's just an alternative method of assessing an admission.
It's the alternative for admission.
Yeah.
Because some institutions have that
Right,
conversion, and so that it turns into having done secondary level in the process of doing the university tertiary level. I know there's at least one institution in Canada that has that. I think it's in British Columbia, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But I have seen that, where it says right on it, these credits are secondary. This indicates that the student has completed secondary, and then they continue on, and then they have a bachelor degree from that institution.
What do some others do? Anyone want to share, what they do with someone who has incomplete and sufficient credentials? Go ahead.
Yeah, so in Sweden, we, depending on the region and so on, but if, for instance, a person is just missing the last exam, or in some cases the last year, that's one example. In such a case, we don't reject the entire school income at that moment. We give a partial recognition, and we give the person opportunity to study at adult education. It's you can say 8 courses in addition to some language. It could take 1 year approximately. So in such a way of they can study for that period, 1 year or less, and then be eligible for.
So like a bridge program, kind of like a pre-university, like to sort of help bridge the gap between.
Exactly, and we apply this, guideline if something is missing, for instance, but also in cases, the refugee schools sometimes, we've also applied it in, I work with Middle Eastern accessibility, where we have conflicts or we have different groups, for instance, transitional governments and so on, Libya and Syria, and in some cases we have even, we have applied this rule for, in such cases. So,
What provision is there for students who can't produce documentation? Would they still be able to, is that where the refugee school come in? Or
actually, we would require
something?
Yeah, we can't, we have actually for our fields, Simon, we work with secondary education, but we have our colleagues at the academic unit. They don't, they have a student have a possibility to explain, but in some, they have to prove in some, it's more open there. We require at least some education grade transcript for the diploma, but at the academic level, if they have student cards, they describe the education, they can in some way.
So like a secondary student who wasn't able to finish in Syria, right? And they have nothing because if they don't have anything, what does that do? They completed 2 years of secondary school, their school was bombed, their home was bombed, they left, documents sank. But what do you do with that student?
With no documents
Nothing.
at all, it's pretty hard. We can't give a recognition.
Is there any opportunity for them to do anything in Sweden in order for them to then continue on, or are they pretty much on?
For admission, there are other ways, but now is recognition.
Recognition, right?
But so admission, there are different ways, but recognition-wise, no, we don't. We can't do anything.
Yeah. In South Africa, you would.
I just wanted to, because if somebody says, I don't have any education, but want to gain admission, or let's say they go to an evaluation body, say they want to do a sector, firstly, information that is necessary, that examination numbers, examination body that instituted the exam and all that, it's also important. And how do you tell if somebody says, and then you want to admit authenticity of the document that you're giving, or the information that the person is giving you? Because we need to bear in mind that education is one of the tools people want to use to empower themselves. Now, if I come before you and I say I do not have any document to substantiate what I'm going to tell you, and you take word of mouth, definitely most children, why should they be in school when they could just leave and go somewhere and claim that they don't have any documentation, so they can gain admission.
In circumstances like that, you're looking at what's happened, right, in a place at a time, right? So if there hasn't been a political or climate-based or some other crisis or incident at the time that they are claiming that they were in an institution, then their stories don't match up. right? So there's got to be some context. So we get a lot of students from Haiti, where I am. We have a huge Haitian migrant population. Many of them are in temporary protected status in the United States, so it's sort of this vague asylee type status between political upheaval and hurricanes and earthquakes in Haiti. It's very difficult to track down anything, right? So if a student says to me, I have nothing from Haiti, there's a pretty good chance that they really don't have anything, but that doesn't mean that I can simply write a letter that says they have completed secondary. They've got to prove something. They've got to take an examination. That's why we in the US, would use some sort of secondary equivalency testing. But if a student came to me, so I had a student actually from Italy a number of years ago, came to me and said, I have nothing. My secondary school was destroyed in an earthquake. Okay, let me look. Is it in a region at the time period that had an earthquake? Was it destroyed? How realistic is that student? So if I had a student from Croatia tell me that their school was destroyed, I would look into it, yeah.
I would like to provide some examples regarding the topics that we've been talking about. Firstly, on the refugees. Actually, we do it quite similarly to our colleagues in Sweden. When an asylum seeker or someone who was already provided with an asylum in Croatia applies for recognition and wants to get admitted to the Croatian university, firstly we are looking for the proof that they have the asylum status. Because, for example, you can have a student from Syria, people from Syria, who normally has his or her secondary education certificates, and he or she is applying for the university, but they do not have the asylum status. So they normally they follow the procedure as everyone else. But if he or she can prove the asylum status, which is given in Croatia by the Ministry of the Internal Affairs, then immediately they get provided with the same rights as Croatian students, meaning that, for example, they don't pay any tuition fee, etc. Now, what happens with the documents? If they have all the grades throughout, they have 3 years of secondary education, but they're only missing the last part, we will do the same thing as they do in Sweden. We have the so-called adult education system, so they can enter that, and then they finish their secondary education in Croatia. Now, what happens if part of the documents is missing before? Like, for example, they have the final secondary education diploma, which means that we can recognize it because we use the benchmarking record, but the admission procedure might be hindered because, for example, year 2 is missing because the school was bombed or it was burned. Then it might happen that the school committee actually meets and they re-examine the student. So that's how they might
So at an institutional level,
at the institutional level, but we are still trying to find better and more consistent ways how to do it. Fortunately or unfortunately, we had only several cases. We were usually lucky enough that the asylum seekers that were applying for the universities in Croatia did have their documents, but we had some cases where they did not have complete. We never faced the case when someone had absolutely nothing. Although we did face something similar, we've had quite an extensive number of applicants from the Ukraine in the past year who decided to apply for Croatian universities. And as we were talking before, they have 11 years of secondary education and then they get their attestat. And in some cases, it happened that they were not able to provide us with actual certified documents because the schools were either bombed or burned or whatever. So simply they told us I cannot go there because I'm going to get literally killed if I go there. And in that case, we had to make a stretch and we had to accept the scanned documents, or also we had to accept, for example, the last 2 years without the previous ones or something missing. And also sometimes they had to take the additional examination situations.
I think that, the common theme here is that it's really case by case, right? I mean, I think that each individual's story is very different. I think if you have, it's important to have these alternative methods of assessment and to apply them consistently and fairly, but you have to do it on a case-by-case basis because everybody is different.
I just forget to I think digitalization is extremely important.
Yeah.
You mentioned my country. We really did have a case some 2-3 years ago. It was a people from Croatia who was entering the university, so there was nothing to be recognized because it was the same country. And she was missing her sophomore year grades. And we said, sorry, we need last 4 years. We cannot allow you to proceed. And she claimed that her school was burned, that there was a fire in the school, and that all documents were burned. We contacted the school that inherited, so to speak, that school. But the whole story ended well because the documents were digitalized, so she was simply able to get them reissued.
That's a really good point, actually, that you're bringing up, is that even within our same education systems, things can happen, right? And so you're going to have even domestic students, we'll say, or domestic individuals who don't know where their documents are, can't access them, they've been destroyed, they've been, in a natural disaster, they've been internally displaced, the entire regime has changed and may not be recognized by a new government for some reason. So, are there policies in place, or are there at least thoughts in place as to how that would work? And can that policy or that vague idea be applied to students or individuals coming into your country? Do you have similar or parallel processes between an internal disaster preparedness or
Mm-hmm. I'm gonna, yeah, please.
Yeah.
Normally we just, since it's Scandinavia, so we have some similarities there.
Sure.
But just to add on, what kind of documentation we require, for those who doesn't have the documentations like secondary education, we have something called Scandinavian Student Philosophy, which is like general study knowledge subjects. And these are 6 subjects that we have in secondary school. For those who doesn't have an education from their home country, first they have to study Norwegian language, and they have to have a certain level of Norwegian, like a B2 level. And after that, if they wish to have a secondary education, they must study these 6 subjects in order to get a qualification documentation to apply for a higher
I'm curious,
education.
how long does that often take for
1 year.
And so that level
They're able to do that in 1 year.
6 subjects, the general study subjects, and it takes 1 year. If you take that 3 by 3, and then
But first they have to achieve a level of Norwegian language.
Normally it takes like up to, depends on the person.
Sure, of
really.
course.
Some people, some person, they manage to take it in 1 year or 1 plus.
Are they able to take that examination without sitting in the classes, or do they have to sit that year's worth of?
The 6 subjects? No, it's for someone who doesn't have that kind of solid Norwegian knowledge, they have to participate.
They have to participate
They
in
have
the
to, because
classes.
these are like the secondary subjects from secondary school.
Right.
So it's like mathematics, it's like
But they can't
science.
just demonstrate their knowledge with taking the exam. They have to go through the course.
They
first.
have to go through
Yeah.
the course. I mean, if they want, they can do it like
Oh, they can.
self-study,
Yeah.
and then they can take the exam. Yes, we have that.
Sure.
Then you can
shout out to the Norwegian Assessment Commission. NOCUT has excellent material on the website on all sorts of refugee and asylee issues specific to each country that you might look up. I go there all the time. It's just a wonderful resource. So.
Go ahead.
We as an entire center have different roles, different from admission officers.
Sure.
Our main task is to help Italian universities to evaluate foreign qualifications of their recognition procedures. So, I mean, in this case, for example, for those refugees who have something, I mean, or only the final diploma or only transcript, we issue our services for free. I mean, our statement of comparability, especially in the cases where the refugee person gives special permission to contact his or her institution which issued the qualification. Then we participated in the Council of Europe project, European Refugee Passport for Refugee Qualification Passport for Refugees. So we learn to do the assessment by questionnaires and interviews. So having this experience, we also organized in Italy, like at least 2 sessions with Italian universities to show them how to evaluate qualifications of refugee people who don't have any qualifications, compiling questionnaires and doing the interviews with, for example, if you are saying that you have diploma in English literature, so the professors who are responsible for English literature in Italy would do the question and the interview.
But does that apply to secondary level as well?
Yes,
Do you do that same process for secondary level?
Yeah.
Of course, the question then differs. You may be asked what the school looked like.
Sure.
What were the uniforms? What were the professors or something?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
There are special questions also for those who claim to have a secondary school qualification.
I think that's interesting. So it's a qualitative assessment as much as a quantitative one.
If there are no documents.
Right. Yeah.
Right, and I didn't realize that
Because
that
there
extended
is-
down the secondary.
Yeah,
That's
and that
fantastic.
there's some knowledge, there's some memory, there's some information always that can be had, even if it's just verbal or, yeah, exactly. Let's skip this slide altogether.
Okay. All right.
So the next slide it was about internal versus external, and making an assessment based on the internal only, and we've already talked about that, so I'm skipping over, and we'll just look at this pretty graphic here, which may cause some of you to break out in hives when you think about like the last 2.5 years, and the interruption to the education system, because this is a map of school closures caused by COVID-19. So it kind of goes through a timeline. And this is available on the UNESCO site. I think it's really fascinating. And it's showing, sort of how many learners were affected by school closures. Not even just school closures, but also, either cancellation or postponement of examinations, all kinds of disruptions. So, here's one that affected most of the world, not just those that were forcibly displaced, right, or facing situations of migration or mobility. We have a little bit of time. I mean, I know that this affected all of us in different ways. I know that we've had to get a little bit more creative, maybe, with our timelines of our assessments. I have an example of a document from Turkey that I think is interesting. But this is also a time to share, like what exceptions have you made? What have you needed to do?
Or what will you need to do as these students start coming?
Yeah, that's
in
been more
years?
creative or more flexible because of COVID-19. How has your process changed? Like, what if?
Has anyone started thinking about this?
Well, I mean, I think it's probably already happened, right? Like, the timeline for certain final examinations, students in Ethiopia, right,
Cancellation
didn't take their exam when they were supposed to, and so it was postponed by however many months or years. So how do you make an admission decision or a recognition or equivalence decision if you don't have that final credential?
Park scenario close to Atlanta. And because of that, a lot of people have families. So we had a lot of students directly from Ethiopia applying. And we made it very clear, because the exam board has continued every single year since COVID to push back the exam due to both the Civil War, along with conflict, and COVID in general. So we make it clear to students if we admit them based on in-progress transcripts or finished transcripts, that they have to have that credential before the semester starts. We need that diploma because most of our students, to be quite frank, will fail math or physics or something. And then that will be, if they're no longer admissible to our Atlanta campus, they'll need to go to a 2-year community college first, or take a placement test in math or something to show that they are ready for college on the math, because we don't want them to fail. So that is the issue, because there is such a discrepancy between their grades on their transcript on how they end up scoring on that secondary school exam. However, we have noticed that a lot of other universities either make the exception and only admitted students based on SAT, which I don't know how they were able to take the SAT, but they did everything but Ethiopia since the exam was canceled. Some students managed, so they were admitted based on transcripts and SAT, or maybe the university they attended was a community college that didn't know about the secondary school exam, never thought past for it. So now we have transfer students who are applying to our university, but they have less than 30 hours of transfer credit. So we have to ask for their high school credentials, and they don't have them. So the concern now is, a lot of the times we've told students, you just have to stay another semester at your current institution until you meet that 30-hour requirement. And I know some private schools have a lot more leeway, but at the state school, you have to have that diploma on file. And we did have the students submit a sewing evaluation of their high school transcript. The evaluation says that they didn't submit that secondary school exam, so we don't know his diploma. So he got a GED already in college, and then got a GED at the same time he was doing his first semester at a different university, so that he could come. And
Rachel, I think that's interesting, because what you're describing is all of the different pathways and routes that a student can take with the same exact background, right? And so what you're saying is, in the U.S., we have institutions where there are open universities, the community colleges usually, or 2-year level higher ed institution that often is very open in terms of its admission, and a student can go through there and then transfer their work and their experience, get credit, recognition for it at a 4-year institution, and move forward that way. They can take an examination of equivalency, and that student did both, really. I mean, to that extent. So that it's interesting, the pathways that they can take. Yeah. Does anybody else have any COVID era recognition ideas, policies?
I can just provide you with 2 experiences. One is from the Ireland in, I believe it was 2020, when the COVID pandemic was at its peak. They normally take the final exam at the end of their secondary education, but they made the official decision that in 2020 the students were not going to take that exam. So we had, I believe, 5 or 6 pupils from Ireland who were applying for Croatian universities in 2020, and it actually said on their secondary education certificate, there was a statement issued by the school or by the national board, I don't remember now, that said students who finish their secondary education in 2020 are exempt from taking the final exam. So then we knew that it was not that the student deliberately did not deliver the results of the final exam. We knew that it was because an exception has been made for that particular year, because they simply could not organize it due to the COVID pandemic.
Right. Yeah. That's that's a very good point. And in that case, you have no choice but to make the decision based on the internal, because that's all that is available.
And I would also like to make another case. Normally, when we accept students from abroad, we ask for a certified translation. We ask for the translation by the certified court interpreter. There must be a stamp by the court interpreter, which means that we are receiving physical documents. So now what happened also in 2020 was a case of students from Italy, because you know that Italy was hit really hard by the COVID pandemic, and there was a massive lockdown. People were literally not allowed to walk their dog outside. And also, how can you ask in such a situation when people are facing a really tragic circumstances and they cannot even leave their house, to go to the post office, to mail the document, to go to the court interpreter? So that's when we started accepting scanned documents for them.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah, because that was the only possible way, because you can't say, go to the translator, then go to the post office, and they can't even leave their house.
So it's not even just what documents you're able to get or not get, but it's how you get them too. It's how they're able to be delivered.
So you have to take into consideration this particular situation in the country of war, in Ukraine, or whatever.
Exactly. Making exceptions based on what is reasonable.
They make the exception, and sometimes that exception may be only temporarily until the situation settles down, and sometimes it may remain as permanent.
But having the policies and having the thinking about those exceptions can help you transfer it to the next time. I hate to say that. But the next time there is a circumstance in which you have to bend the rules, change the rules, alter the thinking. You have this great example from Turkey.
Oh, I just think this was a really interesting one because,
They didn't cancel exams.
No, I got this and I thought, whether or not you know what the grading scale is in Turkey, you can sort of look at the grade trend, right, the grade progression, and see that his this particular student in 9th, 10th, 11th grade was a mostly mediocre student, let's say, right? If you think about the lowest passing grade, he was right there, kind of at the lowest passing grades for most all of his subjects, until you get to his 12th grade class, his last year, which was 2020, 2021, and in each and every one of his classes, he scored 100%. He's a perfect student. And I thought, well, this doesn't seem right. I contacted the principal of the school, and this is a legitimate credential. He didn't make these grades up. They just were assessed. They were on lockdown. They were, not physically in class for this time, and they were graded based on participation, based on whether or not they turned in a homework assignment. Not how well they did on the homework assignment or how well they did on an exam, but just whether they showed up to the Zoom meeting or whether they, checked the box on attendance or turned in this piece of paper. So, the student and his family were very upset that I didn't take these grades into consideration when calculating the GPA. But what would you do? Would you calculate this 100% and into his overall grade point average and say that, this was in the year 2020, 2021. So, at the school level, this was a completely different level of assessment, right? That he wasn't assessed in the same way this final year as he was in his 9th, 10th, and 11th grade years. And the grades weren't really a reflection of his academic ability. It was on his ability to show up to the Zoom meeting, and show his face. This is another example of, you kind of have to sort of throw out that year and not really use it as an indication of the student's academic preparedness.
Or people moving to Italy or work in China and not working in American school. Well, and with the pandemic, all of the Chinese international schools, all the schools were closed. And the IB organization decided to give to everybody a diploma at the end of the year, despite their scores, their actual scores. So when I moved back to Italy, this is something that I faced as an admissions officer. One of the requirements is to actually have the IB diploma. Some students actually had it, but they didn't meet the requirements.
But not based on legitimate, sort of academic performance. It's just like, we're just going to call this year over.
Wow. I had that happen in college.
graduating at the year of the exception, I mean, is it really your fault?
No.
I mean, not really.
No.
So, I mean, I don't know if you should take that out of context, because that person didn't have an opportunity to really
show.
improve,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
So maybe they could have done stellar their senior year.
Absolutely.
Or their 12th grade year,
Yeah.
but they weren't even given that opportunity. Maybe they did get 100%. You don't know. So I don't know if it's fair to say throw it out either, because then you just threw out an entire year for the entire program.
Well, you're not throwing it out, you're recognizing that they completed the level,
Yeah.
but maybe not considering the assessment.
And yes, you don't know, and I just happened to ask, and they happened to give detailed information that this wasn't based on any type of knowledge assessment, it was just based on participation. But yes, you don't know, really, without.
Well, and I have young children, so, I mean, we experience, this is like not just something in higher education, right? I mean, this is systemic for all education.
And we're going to be seeing it, the
Yeah.
effects of it are
For
going to be
years to
seen
come.
for years to come,
So,
absolutely.
I mean, certainly,
Yeah.
We were discussing that yesterday.
Yes.
This exact same topic. I have twin daughters that are in 8th grade now. But when the pandemic, they were in 6th grade, they were just given straight A's for participation. So when they went into the next level, 7th grade, one of my daughters really struggled with math because they were graded on participation instead of their knowledge.
And not really keeping track of who is where.
So they did not learn anything.
Right.
But it helps us understand that sort of, again,
Putting it
go
into
back to that
context.
cultural context of what's happening.
Yeah.
So I wanted to say from Loyola Marymount. Thank you for sharing this, and I feel like this isn't a very far departure from what we're seeing even with our domestic students. So you get this 1 or maybe even now 2 years of pandemic experience, and the great shift from alphanumeric to pass-fail. So and I think it's really important for us to establish together sort of benchmarks of how is it that we're going to approach evaluating these students. Are we going to buffer their GPA, which the student clearly isn't a top student, and give them sort of a pass and give them a huge jump in their GPA, which doesn't really give my administration any idea how the student is going to fare at my institution. How are we going to approach this from a professional assessment point of view? Are we going to throw out that year as pass-fail? I'm not sure if I'm to evaluate pass as a 100 or an A or a 7 if we're looking at IB or whatever numerical evaluation you're giving, or if I'm just going to throw away the year or exclude the year from the evaluation. Yes, in a perfect situation, I'll have an entrance exam to which I can corroborate the student's performance and their preparation to understand how they're going to do at my institution. But this is a fact. Whether you're in Italy or Croatia, or this is what we're going to be approaching, and how are we going to determine the student's performance on par as best as we can provide for our administration, because we're bureaucrats, right? An apples-to-apples comparison. This student's preparation is on par with this student that went to ICEO's football in, Napoli. How are we going to approach it? So
And that
again,
applies, I think the COVID situation was so unique because it was so universal. It allows us to think about those policies that we may not have been thinking about before in terms of displacement or crisis or, it's everybody's talking about it now. Maybe we weren't talking about it to the same extent 5 years ago, and I think that's important. So we're actually going to break for lunch in a minute. But I just want to make sure we have these takeaways from this session, or from this section that Karen was talking about. I think they're really important.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about a lot of this, as far as being creative, being reasonable, understanding that there's a person behind these pieces of paper, right, these documents, but at the same time, and taking it on a case-by-case basis, but at the same time, like having a policy in place so that you can apply it fairly and consistently to the best of your ability, and just to use every available resource, whether it's qualitative, quantitative, just to try the best you can to be able to see the big picture, to be able to fill in the gaps, and to see whether or not this person will be successful, not only for your sake, but for theirs, you know, more importantly, right? That they're not going to be set up for failure, that they're going to be placed in the right direction, in the right place. So
There was one, was there one final question from the, did you have fun? Yeah.
I actually think COVID made an enormous change. For young people who's trapped at critical decision points, it is for them an 8-year project. It is for us, an 8-year project in responding to. For the years behind them, it's a 4-year rescue operation. And for those young people at that point, it's a 4-year rescue operation.
I say this with some passion because I have young people at exactly that point, to whom decisions were done to them, not for them, to them, and exactly that way they say, to them. They have the power.
100%.
And
Right.
risk to them is one of radicalization. And we're the people who will bear the brunt of that if we get it wrong. So the questions I believe need to be asked in making recognition decisions are, what's the risk of being ungenerous? What's the risk of not trusting institutions to respond with incredible responsibility, to actually rise to it when a student doesn't have A to Z in a particular discipline, and to resource it? And I say that as a former teacher and educator and professional. I had students in my class who life was too much to go on. And what did I do? I invested in them. I rose to it. And I think that when the youngsters with COVID experiences and gaps in knowledge go through, that's what we have to do. We have to rise to it. That's our goal.
And I think use that as a lesson as to how we're looking at the secondary school experience overall, not just COVID, not just displaced crises, wars, but how we're looking and considering secondary school and considering the culture of it. It really goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. Like, let's think about what the purpose of secondary school and secondary education is and has been and will move on to be. It evolves like everything else evolves. And I want to point out something that someone said to me a few years ago, and this idea that we as credential evaluation professionals are in many, many cases in a position of being a gatekeeper. We are gatekeepers. We are allowing access to something, to another, further education, to opportunity, to employment, to whatever. The decisions that we're making and how we are making those decisions are what makes a difference in an individual's opportunity and lives. So if we are serving as gatekeepers, how are we thinking about that secondary level of education and what it provides opportunity for and for those individuals? So with that nice heavy thought, I will let you know that it is time for lunch. And that lunch will be until 1:15, so you have 90 minutes. And when you come back, we'll gather and then we'll have a fire alarm at 1:30. But please come back for 1:15 so that we have time to do something very quickly before that fire alarm goes off.
Are they not bringing lunch?
Lunch is served, I believe, right outside.
Okay.
And you're welcome to bring it back in, and yes, anything, yeah.
Yep.
And you'll see me come in and out this afternoon. I have a board meeting to attend, but if I don't see you for whatever reason this afternoon, if you are a first-time attendee or a newcomer, I hope that you'll come to the first-time attendee session at 5:15.